Welcome to Tale Spinners, where we bring stories to life. In this video, we present to you Fallen Love, Bloody Betrayal, Redemption. Without further ado, let's begin. Once upon a time, in the 1800s, there lived a vampire named Marius and a witch named Morgana. They lived in a small village, surrounded by dense forests and mountains, where they would occasionally prey on unsuspecting travelers who passed through the area. Marius and Morgana had been allies for years, drawn together by their shared love of darkness and the power it gave them. Marius was a cunning vampire, his sharp fangs and silver tongue allowing him to lure in his victims with ease. Morgana, on the other hand, was a skilled witch, her potions and spells giving her an edge in battle. Together, they had terrorized the village for years, feeding on its inhabitants with reckless abandon. But as time passed, Marius began to feel a growing sense of emptiness. He had lived for so long that he had grown bored of the same old routine, the same old victims. Morgana noticed the change in him and became concerned. She had grown to rely on Marius, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. So, she decided to do something about it. One night, as they prowled through the village, Morgana caught sight of a young woman. The woman had an air of innocence about her, and Morgana could tell she would be the perfect victim for Marius. So, she used her magic to lure the woman into their grasp. Marius pounced on the woman, his fangs sinking into her flesh. But as he drank her blood, he realized something was different. The woman's blood was sweeter, more intoxicating than any he had ever tasted before. Morgana watched as Marius drained the woman dry, feeling a surge of jealousy in her heart. She had never seen Marius so enraptured by a victim before. But as they made their way back to their hideout, Morgana noticed something strange about Marius. He seemed more alive than ever before, his eyes sparkling with a newfound energy. Over the next few nights, Marius and Morgana continued to hunt together, but Marius was different now. He seemed to have a newfound appreciation for life, a newfound sense of purpose. Morgana couldn't help but feel left out, as if Marius had found something she had always been searching for. One night, as they were out hunting, Marius disappeared without a trace. Morgana searched high and low for him, but he was nowhere to be found. She searched for weeks, but there was no sign of Marius. Just when she had given up hope, Marius appeared before her once more. But he was not alone. He had brought with him a young girl, barely out of her teens. She was beautiful, with long, flowing hair and bright blue eyes. Morgana could tell immediately that she was not human. Marius explained that he had been wandering the countryside when he stumbled upon a group of creatures unlike any he had ever seen before. They were called the Fae, and they had the power to grant immortality to those they deemed worthy. Marius had been deemed worthy, and he had been given the gift of immortality. But the Fae had also given him a task. He was to find and recruit others like him, others who were worthy of the gift of immortality. And that was where the young girl came in. She was one of the Fae, and she had agreed to help Marius find others like him. Morgana was skeptical at first, but she couldn't deny the change she saw in Marius. He was more alive than ever before, more passionate and determined. Together, Marius, Morgana, and the young Fae set out to find others like them. They traveled far and wide. As they journeyed through the countryside, Marius, Morgana, and the Fae encountered all manner of beings: werewolves, witches, and even other vampires. But none of them were quite what Marius was looking for. They were either too bloodthirsty or too weak-willed, and Marius knew that the Fae would never grant them immortality. But then, one day, they came across a small village in the heart of the mountains. It was a place that seemed untouched by time, with thatched roofs and dirt roads that wound between stone cottages. Marius knew immediately that this was the place. He could sense the presence of another like him, someone who had been given the gift of immortality by the Fae. Marius and his companions slipped into the village under cover of darkness, seeking out the creature that had called them there. It didn't take long to find him. He was a vampire like Marius, but unlike Marius, he had become twisted and corrupted by his endless existence. He was a monster, and Marius knew that the Fae would never have granted him immortality if they had known what he would become. But Marius also knew that this vampire was the key to his own immortality. He had been searching for someone who could show him how to fully embrace the gift he had been given, and this twisted creature was the one who could do it. Morgana was skeptical. She could see the darkness in the vampire's eyes, the twisted hunger that had consumed him over the years. But Marius was resolute. He knew that the only way to truly embrace his immortality was to face the darkness head-on, to overcome it and transcend it. So, Marius and the vampire began to train together, honing their skills and pushing each other to new heights. They sparred in the moonlight, racing across the rooftops of the village and leaping through the trees. And as they trained, Marius could feel himself changing, growing stronger and more powerful with each passing day. But there was a cost to his newfound power. As Marius became stronger, he also became more distant from Morgana and the Fae. He could sense their fear and resentment, their growing sense of isolation. But he couldn't stop, couldn't turn back now that he had tasted true power. And then, one night, everything changed. Marius and the vampire were out hunting, their senses attuned to the night. But as they prowled through the woods, they stumbled upon a group of hunters. They were armed with stakes and torches, their eyes blazing with righteous anger. Marius and the vampire fought with all their might, but it was no use. The hunters were too numerous, too determined. Marius watched in horror as the vampire was cut down, his body crumbling to ash in the moonlight. For the first time in centuries, Marius felt fear. He knew that the hunters would come for him next, that they would never stop until he was destroyed. And so, he fled into the night, leaving behind everything he had ever known. For years, Marius wandered the earth alone, haunted by the memory of the vampire's death. He could never forget the fear and the pain, the sense of loss that had consumed him that night. But then, one day, he found himself back in the small village where it had all begun. And there, he encountered Morgana once more. She was older now, her hair streaked with silver, but she still had that same fierce, unyielding spirit that had drawn Marius to her all those years ago. They spoke for hours, recounting the years that had passed since they had last seen each other. As they talked, Marius realized how much he had missed Morgana's company, how much he had missed their shared sense of purpose. He told her of his travels, of the dangers he had faced, and of the lessons he had learned. Morgana listened with a heavy heart. She knew that Marius had been changed by his experiences, that he was no longer the same creature she had known so long ago. And yet, she could see that he still had a spark of goodness within him, that he still yearned for something more. Together, they decided to return to the place where Marius had trained with the vampire. They knew that there were others like him out there, creatures who had been given the gift of immortality but had lost their way. It took them many years to find them, to win their trust and teach them the ways of the Fae. but little by little, Marius and Morgana built a community of creatures like themselves, creatures who had embraced their gift and learned to use it for good. As the years passed, Marius and Morgana grew closer once more. They shared a deep bond that transcended time and space, a bond that had been forged in the fires of hardship and loss. And so, they continued their journey together, always seeking out others who needed their help, always striving to make the world a better place. They knew that there would always be darkness in the world, that there would always be those who sought to do harm. But they also knew that there was light, that there was goodness, and that they had a duty to protect it, to nurture it, and to keep it burning bright. As they walked together into the darkness, Marius and Morgana knew that they would face many more trials and tribulations in the years to come. But they also knew that they would face them together, as partners, as friends, and as creatures of the night. And in the end, they knew that their legacy would endure, that their gift of immortality would live on through the ages, shining like a beacon in the endless night. Marius and Morgana's quest to find and train others like themselves was not an easy one. They encountered many creatures of the night who had turned to the darkness, who had lost sight of their humanity and embraced their powers for evil. Some of these creatures were so consumed by their thirst for blood that they attacked Marius and Morgana on sight. One night, as they traveled through a dark forest, they heard the rustling of leaves and the sound of growling behind them. They turned to see a pack of werewolves charging towards them, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Marius and Morgana stood back to back, ready for the fight of their lives. Marius unsheathed his sword, its silver blade glinting in the moonlight, while Morgana raised her wand and began to chant an incantation. The werewolves attacked with ferocity, their razor-sharp teeth and claws tearing through the air. Marius swung his sword with deadly precision, cutting down werewolf after werewolf, while Morgana's magic sent bolts of energy and blasts of fire hurtling towards their attackers. The battle raged on for what seemed like hours. Marius and Morgana fought with all their strength, using their powers to keep the werewolves at bay. But the creatures of the night were relentless, and their numbers seemed to be endless. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, Marius saw an opening. He charged towards the largest werewolf, his sword held high, and plunged it into the creature's heart. The werewolf howled in pain and fell to the ground, its body transforming back into that of a man. The other werewolves hesitated for a moment, their eyes filled with fear and confusion. And in that moment, Morgana's magic proved to be the deciding factor. With a final incantation, she sent a wave of energy pulsing through the air, knocking the remaining werewolves to the ground and rendering them unconscious. As the dust settled, Marius and Morgana stood, panting and covered in sweat and blood. They had survived the fight, but they knew that there would be more battles to come. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We must keep fighting," Marius said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We must keep fighting until there is no more darkness left in this world." Morgana nodded, a fierce light in her eyes. "We will keep fighting," she said. "We will fight until the very end." And with that, they continued on their journey, ready for whatever lay ahead. For they knew that the darkness would always be there, waiting to strike. But they also knew that they had each other, and that together, they could face anything. As Marius and Morgana continued their quest to find and train other creatures of the night, they encountered a vampire who claimed to have turned his back on the darkness. He had once been a ruthless killer, but now he claimed to have found a higher purpose. The vampire, named Lucian, convinced Marius and Morgana to let him join their group. At first, they were hesitant, but Lucian was charming and persuasive, and soon they welcomed him into their ranks. Over time, Lucian proved to be a valuable member of their community. He trained the new recruits with a fierce intensity, always pushing them to be the best they could be. Marius and Morgana were grateful for his help and his expertise, and they began to trust him completely. But as they later discovered, Lucian had been playing them all along. He had never truly turned his back on the darkness, and he had been using his position of power to gather a group of like-minded creatures who wanted to use their powers for their own gain. One night, as Marius and Morgana were returning from a training session, they found their camp under attack. Lucian and his followers had turned on them, seeking to take over the community for themselves. Marius and Morgana fought with all their might, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Lucian was too strong, too cunning, and too ruthless. He seemed to have an endless supply of vampires, werewolves, and other creatures of the night at his command. In the end, it was Morgana who fell. Lucian delivered the fatal blow, plunging his fangs into her neck and draining her of all her blood. Marius watched in horror as the woman he loved was taken from him, her body collapsing to the ground. Enraged and heartbroken, Marius fought with renewed vigor. He called on every ounce of strength he had, using his sword and his powers to take down Lucian and his followers one by one. Finally, when the last of his enemies lay dead at his feet, Marius collapsed to the ground, exhausted and covered in blood. He wept for Morgana, for all the others who had lost their lives in the fight, and for all those who would never know the light. As the sun began to rise, Marius realized that he was the last of his kind. He was the only one left who could continue the fight against the darkness, who could keep the legacy of the Fae alive. With a heavy heart, he gathered the bodies of his fallen comrades and set out on a new journey, a journey of solitude and sacrifice. He knew that he would face many more trials and tribulations in the years to come, but he also knew that he would never forget Morgana, that he would always carry her memory with him, a beacon of hope in the endless night. And so, he walked on, his sword at his side, his powers at his command, and his heart heavy with the weight of his losses. For he knew that there would always be darkness in the world, but he also knew that there would always be those who would fight it, no matter the cost. Thanks for watching Tale Spinners. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe for more fantastic storytelling.